Winter, 1934. The kind of cold that settles into a town and doesn't leave. A railroad worker named Earl Pruitt is walking his usual night shift along the spur line east of town when he notices something that makes him stop. A freight car sitting on the Hartwell siding. That wouldn't be unusual, except the Hartwell Industrial Works had been closed for 3 years. He checks his clipboard. Nothing scheduled. No manifest for this line. No pickup, no drop-off. Nothing. He walks closer. The car isn't empty. The couplings at the far end connect to 2 more cars behind it. All sitting in the dark. All on a line that officially doesn't receive freight anymore. Earl writes it down in his logbook and keeps walking. He tells himself there's a simple explanation. He's wrong. 3 miles up the road, the Hartwell factory sits behind its iron gates. Windows dark. The main smokestack is cold and silent. A padlock the size of a man's fist on the front entrance. Officially abandoned. But Earl Pruitt would later tell his grandson something he never put in an official report. That night, in the lower section of the building, the loading level where trucks used to back in before dawn, he saw a light. Not a security light, not a lantern, a working light. The kind you'd put on when machinery was running. He didn't stop. He didn't ask questions. It was 1934, and a man with a job kept his head down. But he didn't forget it either. Over the next several months, Earl would log the freight cars 17 more times. Always after midnight. Always the same siding. Always gone before sunrise. He never saw them being unloaded. He never saw who signed for them. And the manifests, when they existed at all, listed the destination as a company name he'd never heard of. Not Hartwell Industrial Works, something else entirely. The factory had officially closed 3 years earlier. So, why were freight cars still arriving after midnight? To understand what was happening at the Hartwell factory, you have to understand what 1931 looked like in a mid-sized industrial town. It looked like this: men standing in lines that didn't move, storefronts with paper in the windows, families eating less, and one morning in October, a notice was posted on the gates of the largest employer in the county, Hartwell Industrial Works. Effective immediately, all operations suspended. 412 workers gone in a single morning. The newspapers ran the story the next day. Hartwell closes. Hundreds thrown out of work. The local coverage was brief and brutal. There wasn't much to say. The Depression had already taken the furniture plant, the textile mill, 2 smaller machine shops. Hartwell was just the largest domino. Management said the right things. Difficult economic conditions. Hope to resume operations when circumstances allow. Deep regret. Within weeks, the machinery was reportedly auctioned off to settle debts. The spur line to the factory was quietly removed from active routing in the railroad's official schedule. The gates were locked. The company offices were shuttered. By Christmas of 1931, Hartwell Industrial Works existed only on paper. A dissolved corporation with no workers, no product, and no future. The town folded around the absence. Families left. Businesses that had served the factory workers, the diner, the hardware store, 2 boarding houses, closed within 18 months. The county tax base collapsed. Schools cut teachers. The hospital reduced staff. What had been a working industrial town became something quieter and smaller and harder, and the factory sat behind its locked gates, silent. Except Several workers who'd been laid off in 1931 would later recall in conversations years afterward that the silence wasn't total. Some said they'd seen lights in the lower windows late at night driving past on the county road. They assumed it was a watchman or kids. Others said they'd noticed the power lines to the building, the ones that should have been disconnected, still had tension in them, still hummed in the cold. Nobody thought much of it. They had other problems. And then the night shipments began. Earl Pruitt wasn't the only one who noticed. Between 1932 and 1938, at least 4 other railroad employees logged irregularities on the Hartwell Spur. None of them compared notes at the time. None of them filed formal complaints. But decades later, when a regional historian named Francis Doyle began pulling together Depression-era railroad records for a county archive project, she found their logbooks sitting in the same storage room, on the same shelf, as if they'd been waiting for someone to read them side by side. What they described independently was the same thing. Freight cars arriving on the Hartwell siding between midnight and 4 in the morning. Not every night, not even every week, but regularly, consistently, for years. The cars were unloaded quickly. One worker estimated the whole operation took less than 90 minutes from arrival to departure. No lights on the exterior of the building. No sound that carried far. And the cars themselves were often unmarked or marked with consignment codes that didn't match any active account in the railroad's ledger system. One logbook entry, dated February 1935, reads, 3 cars on Hartwell siding, 1:40. No manifest on file, no contact person listed. Cars empty by 4 o'clock. Who is signing for these? It's the only entry where the worker broke from his usual notational shorthand. He never got an answer. Then there was what a switchman named Roy Castor saw in the spring of 1936. Castor was repositioning a locomotive at the freight yard, a routine overnight task, when he spotted 2 men he didn't recognize walking the perimeter of the Hartwell loading area. Not workers, not railroad men, both in coats that didn't belong to any department he knew. One of them was carrying something. Castor couldn't tell what. He looked away. When he looked back, they were gone. He noted it in his log as 2 unknown personnel, Hartwell adjacent, 2:15. Francis Doyle circled it in red when she found it. Here's what made her certain something was wrong. Most of the unusual sightings, the freight cars, the lights, the personnel, occurred in a 6-block radius around the factory's lower loading dock. Not the main entrance, not the front of the building, the lower dock, the part of the factory that sat partially below street level, where heavy freight was typically brought in off the rail spur and loaded directly onto the building's freight elevator. The part of the building that, according to every official record, had been sealed shut since 1931. The factory was supposed to be empty, but somebody was still receiving shipments. In the summer of 1937, 3 teenage boys from the east side of town decided to do what teenagers in small towns have always done when there's a large abandoned building nearby. They went to see what was inside. Their names were Danny Kowalski, his younger brother Pete, and a kid everyone called Biscuit, whose real name nobody seems to have recorded. What they found, and what Danny described 40 years later in a letter to his local historical society, was not what they expected from an abandoned factory. They cut through the fence on the north side, the part that backed up against the rail yard. The main building looked dead, windows black. The smokestack is cold. No signs of life at the front or along the sides they could see from the street. But the lower dock was different. Danny wrote, "You could feel something before you could hear it. A kind of pressure in the ground, like there was weight moving underneath where you were standing. Pete said it was his imagination. But then Biscuit put his hand flat on the concrete near the dock ramp, and he didn't say anything after that." The lower loading dock was set into the north face of the building, a recessed area where trucks would back down a ramp to receive freight from the building's lower level. The rolled-down door was shut and padlocked, but the padlock was new, not rusted, not weathered. A new padlock on a supposedly abandoned building, changed recently enough that the metal still had factory finish on it. Danny noticed something else. The dock's freight elevator shaft. A large vertical opening on the interior wall of the loading area, visible through a gap in the roll-down door, had grease on the cables. Fresh grease, the kind you apply to something that moves. He would not stop thinking about that for 40 years. They didn't go inside. They were 15 and frightened and smart enough to understand that a new padlock on an empty building meant someone wanted it to stay empty. But before they left, Pete noticed one more thing. On the concrete apron outside the dock, in a patch of soft ground where water had pooled and dried, there were tire tracks, wide ones, the kind left by heavy trucks, recent enough that the edges were still sharp. The activity wasn't happening above ground. Frances Doyle found the railroad logbooks in 1979. She found the payroll records by accident in 1981. She was going through a collection of financial documents donated to the county archive by the estate of a local attorney who had died without heirs. Most of it was routine: property transfers, incorporation filings, estate inventories. The kind of paperwork that piles up in a legal office over 50 years and gets boxed and forgotten. But near the bottom of the third box, she found something that made her sit down on the archive floor and not move for a long time. It was a payroll ledger, handwritten, dated from 1932 through 1939. The company name on the cover was not Hartwell Industrial Works. It was a name she had never heard: Consolidated Meridian Fabricators. She had never seen that name in any county filing, any newspaper, any directory. She opened it. The ledger listed workers by number, not by name. 41 of them at its peak, paid in cash, on a bi-weekly schedule, through the entire period of the factory's official closure. The disbursement amounts were consistent with skilled industrial labor rates for the era, not day labor, not maintenance, skilled work, the kind of work that required training, and the address listed for the payroll disbursement, the Hartwell Industrial Works Building. Doyle spent the next 6 months tracing Consolidated Meridian Fabricators. What she found: a shell company incorporated in 1931, 2 months before the Hartwell shut down, in a state that required minimal disclosure. Its registered agent was a law firm that had since dissolved. Its officers were listed as 3 individuals, none of whom appeared in any other public record she could locate. The company had, as far as she could determine, no public operations, no products, no customers, no address other than the Hartwell building. It appeared to exist for one purpose: to employ people who were not supposed to be employed at a location that was not supposed to be operating, making something that was not supposed to exist. She found one more thing in the ledger. In the margin of a page from 1934, in handwriting different from the rest, smaller, more careful, someone had written a single word. She spent a long time staring at it before she wrote it into her notes. The word was below. But what exactly were they making beneath the factory? In 1954, a demolition company was contracted to clear the Hartwell site for a planned municipal works project. The factory had sat empty, or apparently empty, since the early 1940s. The building was condemned. The contract was straightforward. On the third day of work, a crew foreman named Albert Sims hit the floor with a sledgehammer in the northeast corner of the lower level and heard something wrong. Not the flat thud of solid concrete over packed earth, the hollow resonance of empty space below. He stopped, had his crew stop, knocked again in several places. The hollow sound extended across approximately 40 square feet of floor, a rough rectangle centered near the interior loading wall. Sims reported it to the site superintendent, who reported it to the contracting company, who reported it to the city engineer's office. Nobody knew what it was. None of the building's original blueprints, filed with the county in 1908 when the factory was first constructed, showed any subterranean level. A decision was made to investigate before continuing demolition. They found the hatch under a false floor panel that had been surfaced with poured concrete to look continuous with the surrounding slab. The concrete was a different mix, slightly different aggregate, slightly different color, which explained why Sims had hit it with a sledgehammer rather than a jackhammer. He'd been testing an area that looked weak. The hatch itself was steel, heavy, set into a frame that had been bolted through the structural floor. It had 2 locks and a ventilation grate. The ventilation grate was connected to ductwork, active ductwork, still intact, running upward into the building's existing HVAC system, the same system that would have been used during normal factory operations. Someone had plumbed this space into the building as if it were a permanent installation, not a temporary shelter, not a storage vault, a workspace. Below the hatch, a steel ladder 12 feet down to a concrete floor. What Albert Sims found at the bottom of that ladder had been sealed for over a decade, but it had not been emptied. The space was roughly 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. The ceiling was low, just over 7 feet. Industrial lighting fixtures, now dead, a ventilation system, a drain in the floor, and along the walls, workbenches, heavy duty, bolted to the concrete, the kind used for precision assembly work. The benches still had vice clamps attached, measuring instruments, tool holders, empty now, but shaped for specific tools, the kind of holders made for equipment that gets used in the same way, in the same position, every single day. On the floor, oil stains. In the grease trap near the drain, metal shavings, small, fine, the residue of machined parts. In one corner, the footprint of a generator. The mounting bolts were still in the floor. In the opposite corner, a freight elevator shaft. The same shaft Danny Kowalski had seen greased cables in 17 years earlier. The space had been built to produce something. It had produced something for years in secret, beneath a factory the entire town believed was dead. and then someone had locked the hatch and walked away. Sims and his crew found the crates on a secondary shelf cut into the far wall, a recessed storage area behind a false panel that one of the crew noticed only because the wall thickness was wrong. The crates were empty, but the stenciling on the wood was still legible. Sims noted the markings in his report, but said he didn't understand what they meant. Frances Doyle, when she found his report 25 years later, understood immediately. And then workers found the crates. The stenciling on the crates referenced a federal procurement contract number. It took Frances Doyle 3 years, 2 Freedom of Information requests, and a contact at a university library with access to wartime federal archives to trace it. What she found was not entirely surprising, given everything else she had found. But it was damning. In late 1931, the same autumn that Hartwell Industrial Works publicly announced its closure, the federal government, through an intermediary procurement office, awarded a classified production contract to a company called Consolidated Meridian Fabricators. The contract was for the production of precision machined components used in specific military and government systems. The contract documents Doyle obtained were partially redacted, but enough remained to make the situation clear. The federal government had needed something made. Something that, for reasons of security or economy or bureaucratic convenience, it did not want made in an operating factory subject to public observation, union oversight, or press attention. The solution was elegant if you don't think too hard about the human cost. Find a factory that was going to close anyway. Let it close, publicly, completely, with all the newspaper coverage and locked gates and official dissolution that implied permanent shutdown. Then, quietly, continue operations underground, literally, with a skeleton workforce paid through a shell company, making precisely what the contract required. The 412 workers who lost their jobs in October 1931 were not laid off because Hartwell couldn't sustain operations. They were laid off because their visible presence made the operation harder to hide. The factory didn't close. The factory disappeared. And in the space where a public industrial operation had been, a secret one took its place. Smaller, more controlled, and entirely invisible to the town that had built its economy around the building. Doyle could not determine exactly who at the company made this decision. The executives who ran Hartwell in 1931 were all dead by the time she began her research. The government officials whose signatures appeared on the redacted contract documents were identified only by title, not by name. Nobody, as far as she could determine, had ever been asked to account for any of it. The workers above ground lost everything. The operation below ground continued for years, profitable and invisible. The factory had never really closed. It had simply disappeared underground. Thomas Wierzbicki was 67 years old when he read Frances Doyle's research summary, published in a small regional history journal in 1984. He had been 22 in 1931, a machinist, one of the 412. He'd gotten the notice on a Tuesday morning, cleared out his locker, walked home and told his wife, spent 3 months looking for work before accepting that there was no work to find, moved his family to his wife's parents' farm in another county, spent the Depression doing farm labor, which he was not trained for and did not enjoy. He never worked as a machinist again. The skills he'd spent 6 years developing were useless by the time the economy recovered enough to need them. The industry had moved on. He was too old to re-enter at the bottom. He told Doyle in a letter he wrote after reading her article, "I spent a long time thinking we had just been unlucky, that the timing was wrong and the economy was wrong, and that's how it goes. I told my kids that. I told my grandkids that. Now I'll find out the machines kept running." He was not alone. Of the 412 workers laid off in 1931, Doyle managed to trace records for about half. The picture they formed was consistent: displacement, economic hardship, loss of skilled trade, family disruption. Several deaths that might plausibly be attributed to the stress and poverty of the Depression years. Children who grew up in reduced circumstances, some of whom never recovered economically. Meanwhile, 41 workers, their identities still hidden behind numbers in a ledger, continued working in the building those 412 had been locked out of, making parts, being paid, going home. Doyle never identified who those 41 workers were. They may not have fully understood what they were part of. They may have been as much instruments of the arrangement as victims of it. But the 412 had no such ambiguity. They had simply been removed. The town itself recovered, eventually. Slowly. Not to what it had been. By the time the underground operation ended, sometime in the early 1940s, based on the payroll records, the community had restructured around its absence. The factory building sat empty for another decade before demolition. The economic recovery that came after the war came unevenly, and the particular industrial ecosystem that Hartwell had anchored never fully reconstituted itself. Some towns lose their factory and rebuild. Some don't. This one didn't. For 20 years, the town believed the factory had died. Frances Doyle published her full research in 1986. It received modest attention. A local newspaper story, a mention in a regional history quarterly, a letter of acknowledgement from the County Historical Society. No federal agency commented. No corporate successor. Hartwell had been fully dissolved, its assets absorbed and reabsorbed through decades of industrial consolidation. Acknowledged the findings. No one filed suit. No hearing was convened. The contracts remained partially classified. The identities of the 41 workers remained unknown. The officials responsible remained unnamed. The factory had been demolished in 1954. The underground level, once photographed and documented by Albert Sims's crew, was filled with concrete and sealed. The site became a municipal parking structure, then a park, then a vacant lot that the city has been trying to develop for 30 years. There is no marker. What survived was the railroad freight logs. Doyle cross-referenced every entry she could find. Earl Pruitt's logbook, the 4 other employees' records, the yard manifests that hadn't been destroyed, and arrived at a number. Between November 1931 and March 1939, 47 documented midnight freight deliveries to the Hartwell Spur, 47 arrivals logged after midnight, 47 departures before dawn, 47 times that freight moved in and out of a factory that was not supposed to exist, in a building the town had watched close, on a rail line that had been officially decommissioned. 47 times, and nobody asked the right question. Or rather, some people asked. Earl Pruitt asked. Roy Castar asked. Danny Kowalski put his hand on a concrete floor and felt the weight of something moving beneath it and understood, in the wordless way a 15-year-old understands things, that the answer was somewhere he wasn't supposed to go. They wrote things down. They kept their heads down. They moved on. The question went unanswered for 50 years. The workers believed the factory had failed. The town believed the machines had stopped. But beneath the locked floors of Hartwell Industrial Works, beneath the sealed hatch, beneath the false concrete, beneath the building that 412 people had walked out of on a Tuesday morning in October 1931, 47 freight cars had kept arriving after midnight. And somewhere below the factory floor, the machinery had never stopped running at all.